Everything you were taught about the beginning of civilization is probably true. It is also probably incomplete, not because historians got it wrong, but because the world they were looking at was missing a third of its coastline. 12,000 years ago, the sea was 120 meters lower than it is today. The land where most people on Earth actually lived, the fertile coastal lowlands, the river deltas, the sheltered bays, is now underwater. It has never been excavated. We have never looked. The story of civilization, as most of us learned it, begins in a river valley. Two rivers, to be precise, the Tigris and the Euphrates, running through the land that is now Iraq. Between them lay a strip of fertile soil unlike almost anything else on Earth. It flooded predictably, left behind rich silt, and produced grain in quantities that changed what was possible for the people who farmed it. Sometime around 4000 BC, the people of this valley, the Sumerians, began organizing themselves in ways no human group had managed before. They built cities, they appointed administrators, they invented the wheel. And around 3200 BC, in the city of Uruk, a scribe pressed a reed stylus into a damp clay tablet and made the first marks that we can confidently call writing. The oldest known written record is a list of grain sacks and heads of cattle. From that moment, we have an unbroken chain. Tablets, inscriptions, monuments, archives, a continuous record stretching from Uruk to the device you are watching this on right now. Egypt followed close behind, rising along the Nile around 3100 BC. The Indus Valley civilization appeared in what is now Pakistan and India. Ancient China formed along the Yellow River. The Maya built their cities in Mesoamerica. One after another, in valley after valley, the pattern repeated. This is the conventional story, and it is not wrong. These civilizations were real. Their achievements were extraordinary. The evidence for them is solid, excavated, and well dated. But here is the question that the conventional story does not ask. Why then? Human beings with brains identical to ours had been walking the earth for at least 300,000 years before the first city rose in Mesopotamia. For the overwhelming majority of our existence, nothing that we would call civilization appeared anywhere. 300,000 years of anatomically modern humans. Identical cognitive capacity, identical potential for language, planning, and cooperation, and for 295,000 of those years, silence, no cities, no writing, no monuments we can find. The standard explanation is that civilization had to wait for agriculture, and agriculture had to wait for the climate to stabilize after the last ice age. Around 10,000 BC, as the glaciers retreated and temperatures rose, humans in the Fertile Crescent began cultivating wheat and barley for the first time. Settled life followed. Cities followed that. It is a tidy explanation, and it probably contains a great deal of truth. But it rests on an assumption so deeply embedded in how we do archaeology that almost nobody states it out loud. That the places we have looked are the places where civilization first appeared. Archaeology is by necessity a science of what survives. Stone survives, baked clay survives, dry elevated ground preserves what wet low-lying ground destroys. The sites we have excavated, catalogued, and dated are the sites that were accessible. Above ground, above water, waiting to be found. The sites that are not accessible have not been searched, and a very large number of those sites are underwater, submerged beneath the coastlines that rose as the ice melted and the seas climbed. Slowly at first, then in pulses sharp enough to move the shoreline inland within living memory. The story of civilization as we know it is the story of what survived. What that means for what we do not know is the question this asks. Stand at the eastern coast of England today and look out across the gray waters of the North Sea. The horizon is roughly 30 miles away. Beyond it, invisible beneath the surface, lies a land that was once home to forests of oak and hazel, wide river valleys, and the camps of people who hunted along its banks. 20,000 years ago, that water was not there. The North Sea did not exist. In its place stretched a low, fertile plain, woodlands, wetlands, and river systems, connecting Britain directly to what is now Denmark and Germany. Families lived there, lit fires there, buried their dead there. It had a name given to it by modern researchers, Doggerland. Doggerland covered at least 180,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of England and Scotland combined, now sitting under 60 to 120 meters of water. Trawler nets have pulled up its remnants for over a century, a barbed antler harpoon, ancient peat, the bones of mammoths, the tools of people who had no idea their world would one day be a seabed. Doggerland was not unusual. It was one of dozens of such places scattered across every ocean on Earth, each of them a world that existed, was inhabited, and is now gone beneath the water. The Ice Age reshaped the entire planet's surface, and nowhere more dramatically than along its coastlines. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, so much of the Earth's water was locked inside ice sheets that the global sea level stood approximately 120 meters lower than it stands today. The effect on the world's coastlines was staggering. In Southeast Asia, the scattered archipelago of islands we know as Indonesia did not exist. The Java Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, and large portions of the South China Sea were dry land. A vast subcontinent stretching from the Malay Peninsula all the way to Borneo, Sumatra, and Java. Researchers call it Sundaland. At its maximum extent, it covered approximately 1.8 million square kilometers, a landmass larger than India, flat, river-crossed, and sitting squarely in the tropics. The people who lived on Sundaland were, genetically, among the most significant populations in human history. The descendants of those who crossed from it into the islands beyond are the Aboriginal Australians, among whom the oldest continuous culture on Earth is found. As early as 60,000 years ago, people were already capable of open water navigation to reach Australia. Their homeland, the continent from which they launched, is now beneath the South China Sea. On the other side of the planet, the land bridge between Russia and Alaska, Beringia, covered roughly 3 million square kilometers at its maximum extent. It was not a narrow strip of land, but a wide, stable, largely unglaciated plain, home to the megafauna of the late Pleistocene and the people who followed them. The ancestors of every indigenous American crossed that bridge. The bridge itself is now the Bering Strait. The Persian Gulf did not exist as a body of water at all. The land now submerged beneath it was dry, a river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin rivers, converging into a single great waterway that ran south through what is now the Gulf floor and emptied into the Indian Ocean. This valley was sheltered, well-watered, and occupied. The civilizations that later rose at its northern end, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, were building on the exposed upper reaches of a river system whose lower portions were already underwater. And in every ocean the same pattern held. The continental shelves of India, the east coast of North America, the coasts of West Africa and Brazil, the margins of Australia, wherever the seabed shallows to less than 120 meters, there was once land. Not desert, not ice, land. The kind of flat, low-lying, river-fed coastal plain where humans, in every era we can observe, have preferred to live. In total, the area of land submerged between the peak of the last ice age and the present is estimated at roughly 27 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, the continent of Africa covers approximately 30 million square kilometers. The world lost to rising water a landmass nearly the size of Africa, and nearly all of it was coastal lowland, the most habitable terrain on Earth. None of it has been systematically excavated. Almost none of it has been searched at all. The archaeological record of the Ice Age and the period immediately following it is, almost by definition, a record only of what survived above the waterline. The inland sites, the elevated sites, the sites accessible to a researcher with a shovel and a permit, not to a diver working in 80 meters of murky water on a continental shelf. The question is not whether people lived on those coastlines. They did. The genetics, the migration routes, the coastal foraging patterns all confirm it. The question is what, if anything, they built there and whether any of it remains. What we know for certain is that when the seas rose, they rose fast enough to matter within a human life. The geological record shows peak rates exceeding a meter per century during the most intense meltwater pulses, fast enough that a child born on a coastal plain could, by old age, watch the water standing where their childhood home once stood. This was not a slow drift felt only in the abstract. It was a lived displacement generation by generation from the richest land on earth. The people who retreated from those coasts carried everything they knew with them. Their tools, their stories, their methods, their memories of the land that was swallowing itself behind them. What they could not carry was the land itself, or anything fixed to it. The structures, the hearths, the cultivated ground, the graves, all of it went under. Most of it was built of organic material, the kind that a rising sea and shifting sediment erase within centuries. The flood, in this case, was not myth. It was geology, measurable, datable, and vast in its consequences. And its timing aligns with something that has never been fully explained. Why, after 295,000 years of modern human existence with no trace of complex organization, cities and writing, and monumental architecture appeared almost simultaneously in multiple locations around the world, precisely when the seas finally stopped rising and the coastlines finally held still. The ice did not melt steadily. It did not release the sea in a slow, even climb that gave every generation time to adjust and move on. It melted in surges, great pulses of meltwater that poured from collapsing ice sheets into the world's oceans and pushed the shoreline inland faster than anything alive could easily outpace. The first major pulse came around 14,600 years ago. Geologists call it Meltwater Pulse 1A. In roughly 500 years, the global sea level rose somewhere between 16 and 25 meters. On the flat coastal lowlands where most people lived, land that barely rose above the water to begin with, a meter per century meant something real and visible. Your grandfather's fishing ground was shallower than your father's. Your father's was shallower than yours. On the Sunda Shelf, the exposed floor of what is now the South China Sea, the record is precise. During Meltwater Pulse 1A, the sea rose as much as 16 meters in just 300 years. The great flat plain of Sundaland, a continent that had been home to human populations for tens of thousands of years, began to drown in earnest. Rivers that had run hundreds of kilometers to the sea now ran shorter distances each generation. Picture what that meant for a family living on the lower reaches of one of those rivers. Their settlement was on a bank above the flood level. It had always been above the flood level. But the floods were coming higher each decade, not dramatically, not apocalyptically, just higher, a little higher every year, until the year the bank did not drain, and then the year the bank did not dry out at all, and then the year the river simply became the sea. This is not speculation about the experience. It is the only experience available on flat, low coastal land when the sea rises at a meter per century. You do not outrun it. You retreat from it, season by season, generation by generation, watching the landmarks of your world disappear behind you into the water. By around 10,000 years ago, the Great Plain of Sundaland was already substantially diminished. The Java Sea had flooded, the Gulf of Thailand was filling. The rivers that had connected the interior to the coast were becoming estuaries, then inlets, then open water. The people who had lived on those plains for 60,000 years were being compressed onto higher ground, onto the islands we now call Sumatra, Borneo, Java, the Malay Peninsula. In the North Sea, the same story played out on a smaller but no less human scale. Doggerland, that forested lowland connecting Britain to the continent, was shrinking. By 8,000 years ago, it had become an island, the high ground of what is now the Dogger Bank, standing above an encroaching sea. The forests were drowning. A CETA DNA study published in 2025 found oak, elm, and hazel growing in Doggerland as late as 16,000 years ago. temperate woodland in a landscape now sitting under the cold gray water of the North Sea. Then, around 6200 BC, something additional happened. Deep underwater off the Norwegian coast, a section of continental shelf, approximately the size of Iceland, destabilized and collapsed. It was one of the largest underwater landslides in recorded geological history. The Storegga slide sent a wave across the North Sea that reached the coasts of Britain and Scandinavia within hours. On Scotland's northern and eastern coastline, the wave drove approximately 29 kilometers inland. A sediment layer deposited by that wave, fine sand and pebbles ripped from the Norwegian seabed, has been found at sites across Scotland and northern England. It is 45 centimeters thick in some places. Coastal settlements in its path did not survive it. Estimates suggest up to a quarter of the Mesolithic population of Britain was lost in a single event. What remained of Doggerland was finished. The high ground that had persisted as an island above the encroaching sea was overwhelmed. The communities that had lived on it, fishing its shallow waters, hunting along its retreating shorelines, holding whatever knowledge they carried, scattered into the surrounding lands or were gone. By 5,000 years ago, the last of it was underwater. The Black Sea tells a different but equally dramatic story. Before the post-glacial period, it was a large freshwater lake sitting well below the level of the Mediterranean. As the seas rose, Columbia University geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that around 7,600 years ago, the natural land barrier at the Bosphorus was breached, and Mediterranean saltwater poured through into the freshwater basin. The debate about how catastrophic that inflow was continues among geologists. Some argue for a sudden flood, others for a more gradual connection. What is not disputed is that the Black Sea basin changed dramatically during this period, and that the fertile lowlands around its former shoreline, inhabited, farmed, and settled, were inundated. In every case, the pattern is the same. The water came for the most valuable land first. The flat, fertile, well-watered coastal plains that had sustained the largest concentrations of people for the longest time. It came at different rates in different places. Sometimes a meter per century, which is visible within a lifetime. Sometimes faster, always irreversibly. The people who retreated from these coasts carried everything they knew. The settlements they left behind, the structures, the hearths, the refuse heaps, the graves, went under with the land. Most of them were built of organic material, wood, reed, wattle, and daub. The sea does not preserve what wood and reed leave behind on a flat, muddy, shifting continental shelf. What survives from this period is almost exclusively what was built on high ground, in dry conditions, in stone, and there is very little of it. The conventional story of civilization begins precisely when the seas stopped rising and stable. Permanent settlement on elevated river plains became possible. The question hanging over that story is what came before the waters settled. The answer, if there is one, is under the sea. On the continental shelves, in the silted river valleys, on the drowned plains that once held the most people and produced the most food and have never once been systematically searched by anyone with the tools and the funding to do it properly. The sea has barely been asked the question. What it might say in reply is the subject of everything that follows. There is a version of this story that goes, "We have searched, we have found nothing, therefore there was nothing to find." It is a version that sounds reasonable. It is also, when examined carefully, a version built on a misunderstanding of how the past reaches us at all. Everything we know about human prehistory comes from what survived, not what existed. What survived. Those are not the same thing. The gap between them is enormous, and the gap is not random. It has a shape, a bias, and a direction. It systematically favors the high, the dry, the stone-built, and the inland, and it systematically erases the low, the wet, the timber-built, and the coastal. Consider what it takes for something to become a fossil. An organism must die in the right conditions, near sediment, not on exposed rock or open ground. It must be buried quickly before scavengers and decomposition dissolve it. The burial medium must contain the right minerals. The pressure and chemistry must be correct for mineralization to replace the organic material before it disintegrates. And then, millions of years later, erosion must expose it in a place where someone is looking for it. Each of those steps is independently unlikely. Together, they are extraordinarily rare. Less than 1% of organisms that have ever lived leave any fossil trace at all. The fossil record is not a complete library of ancient life. It is the handful of pages that happen to land face up in the right kind of mud. The numbers make this visceral. Tyrannosaurus rex roamed North America for roughly 2.5 million years. Researchers at the University of California calculated that approximately 2.5 billion individual T. rex lived and died across that span. Fewer than 100 individual specimens have ever been recovered, many of them represented by a single bone, the most complete T. rex ever found, named Sue, preserves around 90% of her skeleton. She survives because she was buried rapidly by water and sediment immediately after death in exactly the right conditions. Every other T. rex that ever lived decomposed, scattered, and returned to the soil without a trace. We have recovered roughly 1 T. rex for every 80 million that ever lived. That is the fossil record at its most generously sampled. A large, hard-boned animal from a well-studied geological formation in one of the most archaeologically active countries on Earth. For species with smaller bones, softer bodies, or the misfortune to have lived in environments that erode rather than preserve, the numbers are incomparably worse. Now apply that logic to human beings. Homo sapiens has existed for approximately 300,000 years. For all but the last 5,000 of those years, we left no writing, no fired brick, no monumental stone architecture, the materials that survive geological time. We built in wood, in reed, in hide and bone. We lived in structures that decomposed within decades of being abandoned. We moved, we settled, we moved again. The physical signature of 295,000 years of human life is almost entirely gone. Not because nothing happened, but because the materials in which it happened do not persist. What does persist is what was built in stone, in favorable conditions, on ground that remained above water. The stone temples of the Middle East, the rock-cut tombs of Egypt, the elevated inland sites that the rising sea never reached. These are what archaeology has studied, dated, and built its timeline from. They are genuinely the oldest things we have found. The question the geological record forces us to ask is whether they are the oldest things that existed. There is a concept in archaeology called taphonomic bias, the systematic distortion introduced into the record by differential preservation. A site built on a floodplain erodes and disappears. A site built on limestone survives. The archaeologist who excavates the limestone site does not conclude that the floodplain was empty. But at the scale of entire submerged continents, this reasoning has rarely been applied with full rigor. Published research in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology has noted directly that the largely terrestrial archaeological record may provide a biased, misleading, and incomplete picture of human evolution, dispersal, and environmental interaction. Specifically because the coastal record for most of human prehistory is now submerged. This is not fringe commentary. It appears in peer-reviewed journals and is acknowledged by mainstream researchers. The implications have simply not been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of when civilization began. The sediment record offers a different kind of witness. In sedimentary cores drilled from ocean floors and lake beds, a few centimeters of compressed material can represent 1,000 years of deposition. Within those centimeters, future scientists will eventually find the chemical signature of our own era, the nitrogen from our fertilizers, the carbon from our industry, the isotopic traces of the Anthropocene. A civilization that burned fossil fuels, cleared forests, and redirected the world's nitrogen supply will leave a fingerprint in the sediment whether or not a single building of ours survives above the waterline. That same logic works in reverse. If an earlier civilization had reached anything like industrial scale, its chemical fingerprint would almost certainly be visible somewhere in the sediment layers of the right geological period. The fact that no such fingerprint has been clearly identified places a real constraint on what could have existed. But it does not foreclose the question of organized, complex pre-agricultural societies living on coastlines that are now underwater, societies that never reached the industrial threshold but were, by any reasonable measure, civilized. The distinction matters. The absence of an industrial carbon signal rules out one kind of lost civilization. It does not rule out the kind that built in wood and reeds on river deltas, organized itself around fishing and trade, remembered its own history and stories, and left its bones on a continental shelf now sitting under 80 meters of water. What we have found tells us something. What we haven't found tells us something too, but only if we are honest about why we haven't found it. Absence of evidence in archaeology is only evidence of absence when you have actually looked. On the submerged continental shelves of the world, where the most inhabited lowlands of the Ice Age now lie under the sea, we have barely looked at all. In the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in southeastern Turkey, on the crown of a limestone ridge overlooking a wide plain, there is a site that has been quietly dismantling the conventional story of civilization for 30 years. It has not made the mainstream uncomfortable because it belongs to fringe theorists. It has made the mainstream uncomfortable precisely because it does not. Göbekli Tepe was first noted by researchers in the 1960s and dismissed as a medieval cemetery. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site and recognized immediately that the stones emerging from the hillside were something else entirely. He began excavations the following year and continued until in 2014, never fully recovering from the implications of what he had found. What Schmidt uncovered were circular enclosures of massive, T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 50 tons, arranged in rings with 2 larger central pillars at the heart of each structure. The pillars are carved with extraordinary precision: foxes, lions, vultures, scorpions, and abstract symbols rendered in low relief across stone that was quarried, shaped, and raised without metal tools, without the wheel, and without any evidence of a settled agricultural community nearby. The site has been radiocarbon dated to between 9600 and 8200 BC, predating the first confirmed agriculture in the region by at least 1,000 years. The people who built it had no pottery, no domesticated animals, no written language. They were hunter-gatherers, almost certainly nomadic for much of the year, and they raised the world's oldest known monumental architecture. To build the largest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe required coordinating hundreds of workers over extended periods, quarrying stone, transporting multi-ton pillars across rough terrain, and carving them with fine detail using only flint tools. The society that could organize and sustain that effort was not a small band of wanderers. It numbered in the thousands, at minimum. It had hierarchy, planning, and a shared symbolic system sophisticated enough to fill an entire hilltop with meaning. All of this predates what we previously considered the prerequisites for complex society. Agriculture was supposed to come first, producing the food surplus that allowed specialization, which allowed hierarchy, which allowed monument building. Göbekli Tepe inverts that sequence entirely. The monument came before the farm. Complexity arrived before settlement. The textbook was wrong, and the textbook has not yet been fully rewritten. But the detail about Göbekli Tepe that stops the serious observer cold is not its age or its scale. It is what happened to it. Around 8000 BC, the enclosures were deliberately filled in. Not abandoned, filled. The builders, or their descendants, brought enormous quantities of rubble, animal bone, and flint debris and packed the structures to the tops of their pillars. The site was intentionally buried, layer by layer, preserving it in near-perfect condition beneath the hill that bears its name. Whatever the reason, ritual closure, the coming of a new belief, a deliberate act of preservation, it was done with intention and an enormous effort. Only about 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. The hill contains at minimum 16 more enclosures that ground-penetrating radar has located, but no excavator's hand has yet reached. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. The surrounding region of southeastern Turkey has yielded a series of related sites, among them Karahan Tepe and Sefer Tepe, sharing the same T-pillar iconography and symbolic system, suggesting not a single anomalous gathering place, but a network of connected communities operating across a wide landscape more than 11,000 years ago. Several thousand kilometers to the southeast, beneath the waters of the Gulf of Khambat off the western coast of India, sonar surveys conducted by India's National Institute of Ocean Technology in the year 2000 mapped geometric structures on the seabed at depths of around 36 meters. The patterns, rectilinear arrangements covering several kilometers, are consistent with human settlement. Artifacts recovered by dredging, including pottery fragments and worked stone, were carbon dated to approximately 7500 BC. The site's age and human origin remain contested among archaeologists, partly because the artifacts were recovered by dredge rather than controlled excavation, which makes confident attribution difficult. What is not contested is that the seabed in this region was dry, habitable land until the seas rose at the end of the last ice age, and that whatever was built there went under with it. Off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, a diver discovered in 1986 a series of underwater formations featuring what appeared to be terraces, steps, ramps, and flat-cut surfaces at depths of between 5 and 25 meters. The site has divided geologists and archaeologists since its discovery. Some argue the formations are entirely natural, the result of the way this particular sandstone fractures along horizontal and vertical planes. Others point to the precision of certain right-angle cuts and the arrangement of features that would be extraordinary coincidences for purely natural processes. The sea level at Yonaguni was at least 25 meters lower than today around 10,000 years ago. If any part of the structure is artificial, it predates every known East Asian civilization. What Göbekli Tepe, the Gulf of Khambat, and Yonaguni share, whatever their individual interpretation, is a common condition. They represent the edge of what has survived, been preserved, or been found in a world where most of the relevant landscape no longer exists above the waterline. Göbekli Tepe survived because it was built on stone on a hilltop and because its builders buried it. The submerged sites survived only as ambiguous echoes underwater that archaeology has barely begun to read. The Gunung Padang site in West Java, by contrast, offers a lesson in the other direction. For years, it was promoted as evidence of a structure tens of thousands of years old, older than any known pyramid, older than Göbekli Tepe by a factor of 2 or 3. A paper making that claim was published in 2023 and retracted in 2024 after reviewers established that the radiocarbon dating had been applied to soil samples with no confirmed connection to any human-made feature. The site itself is real and genuinely old. Established estimates place human use of it at around 5000 BC, but the extraordinary claims collapsed under scrutiny because the methodology had not been sound. That episode matters not because it discredits the broader question, but because it illustrates exactly what rigorous underwater and submerged site archaeology requires. The question of what lies beneath the post-glacial seas is legitimate, scientifically grounded, and unresolved. It demands the standard of evidence that Göbekli Tepe meets: careful excavation, controlled dating, published methodology, and peer review. What it does not require, and what does not serve it, is the kind of claim that collapses when the data is examined carefully. Göbekli Tepe met that standard and still overturned the textbook. The evidence for organized human complexity before the conventional timeline of civilization does not need to be inflated. It is already extraordinary enough to demand a rethinking of what we think we know. and of how much of what we do not know is simply lying under the sea, waiting for someone with the tools and the will to go and look. What the oldest things we have found tell us, taken together, is that the capacity for complex organization, shared symbolism, and monumental construction existed in human beings long before the river valley civilizations we call the cradle of civilization. The question that remains, and that the submerged continental shelves make urgent, is not whether that capacity existed. It is where else it was exercised, and what became of those places when the water came. The water came for the coasts first, for the deltas and the sheltered bays, and the river mouths where people had lived longest and built most. It always does. The low ground goes first, and the low ground is where civilization, in every era we can observe, has chosen to begin. What that means for the oldest chapters of the human story is not a mystery to be solved by theorists. It is a problem to be solved by oceanographers, marine archaeologists, and the kind of sustained institutional investment that has not yet been directed at the question with anything approaching the seriousness it deserves. Walk through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro today, and you are walking through streets that were laid out with precision, oriented to the cardinal directions, lined with fired brick, connected to a citywide drainage system that carried waste and water through covered underground channels beneath every major thoroughfare. The streets are straight, the bricks are standardized, the planning is unmistakable. Mohenjo-Daro was built around 2500 BC on the banks of the Indus River, in what is now Pakistan. At its height, it housed approximately 40,000 people. A figure that sounds modest against modern cities, but was extraordinary by the standards of its era, when most settlements on Earth held fewer than 10,000 inhabitants. Across the broader civilization, more than 1,400 sites have now been identified, spanning a territory larger than Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. The total population at its peak is estimated to have been as high as 5 million people. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-Daro had a private bathroom. Waste from upper floors ran down enclosed terracotta pipes set into the brick walls. At street level, the pipes connected to covered sewers running beneath the roads, which carried effluent out of the city through gravity-fed channels. Individual household wells provided fresh water. The system was not improvised. It was engineered, standardized, and maintained across the entire urban grid. A sanitation achievement comparable in ambition to anything Rome would build nearly 2,000 years later. The standardization extended well beyond plumbing. Across every excavated site of the Indus Valley civilization, from the ports of Gujarat to the cities of the Punjab, bricks were made to the same proportions, a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4. Weights and measures followed a decimal and binary system that was consistent from one city to the next across a territory of 1.5 million square kilometers. Two merchants from cities separated by hundreds of kilometers, speaking perhaps different dialects, would have used the same weight system to conduct a transaction. That does not happen by accident. It requires governance, communication, and a shared institutional framework operating at a scale that archaeologists are still struggling to fully understand. What archaeology has not found at any Indus Valley site is equally revealing. There are no palaces, no royal tombs filled with gold and attendants, no monuments to named kings, no armies memorialized in carved stone. The imagery that dominates the civilization's small carved seals, of which thousands have been recovered, features animals, abstract symbols, and what appear to be ritual scenes. No individual is depicted in the posture of power over others. For a society of 5 million people operating across a subcontinental territory with standardized weights, planned cities, and intercontinental trade, the absence of obvious hierarchy is one of the most extraordinary facts in the entire archaeological record. The Indus civilization traded with Mesopotamia. Indus seals have been found at sites in the Gulf region. Mesopotamian texts refer to trade with a land called Meluha, Almost certainly the Indus Valley, exporting cotton, timber, and semi-precious stones. The trade network was not peripheral. It connected the two largest urban civilizations on Earth at the time. And yet the two civilizations appear, on current evidence, to have developed largely independently, each arriving at urban complexity by somewhat different paths in roughly the same historical window. That simultaneous emergence is the detail that the submerged coastline hypothesis makes most urgent. Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley reached urban organization within centuries of each other after 295,000 years in which nothing comparable had appeared anywhere. Egypt followed close behind, China somewhat later. Several civilizations, in different regions, crossed a threshold within roughly the same geological moment, precisely when the post-glacial sea level finally stabilized and the coastal lowlands that had been flooding for millennia became, at last, solid ground. One reading of that timing is coincidence. Another is that the stabilization of the coastlines made certain kinds of settled, coastal adjacent civilization possible for the first time. A third is that some knowledge, some set of practices or technologies or social organizations had been developing in the lowlands before the floods, and that its carriers, displaced by the rising water onto higher ground, brought it with them to the river valleys, where history eventually records it. The Indus Valley civilization did not emerge from nothing. Its early phase, before 2600 BC, shows settlements gradually increasing in size and complexity over centuries, a recognizable developmental sequence leading up to the mature urban period. But before that early phase, the record grows thin. The coastal regions of northwestern India and Pakistan, the zones of early human movement and settlement along the Arabian Sea, are now substantially underwater. The continental shelf off the Gujarat coast sits at depths consistent with habitation during the last ice age. The Gulf of Combat sonar surveys sit within that same drowned geography. The Indus civilization is the clearest window we have into what early human urban organization actually looked like at scale. Its engineering, its governance, its trade, its symbolic life. It is extraordinary. And the question it leaves open is not what it was, but where the knowledge that produced it came from, and whether any part of that knowledge trail runs through a landscape that no longer exists above the waterline. When the Indus civilization declined, beginning around 1900 BC, its cities were not destroyed. They were gradually abandoned, the population dispersing eastward toward the Ganges plain and into smaller settlements. The script they used, still undeciphered, still unread after a century of effort, went with them into silence. Whatever they knew, whatever they wrote, whatever administrative and symbolic system required that consistent, standardized script across 1.5 million square kilometers, it passed out of the record. The script may one day be decoded. What it says, when it is, will be one of the most significant moments in the history of human knowledge. For now, the Indus Valley tells us what is possible with early human organization, the engineering, the planning, the trade, the probable governance without kings. It tells us this was achievable in this era with these materials and this level of technology. And it tells us, by implication, that if something comparable had existed before the flood, smaller, perhaps, less dense, built of wood and reed rather than fired brick, it would not have left us anything we could easily find. The Indus civilization survived because it built in the right place, at the right time, in the right materials. What came before it, if anything did, was not so fortunate. The river valleys kept their records, the coasts did not. That asymmetry is the quiet engine behind everything this inquiry is trying to understand, not a conspiracy, not a suppression, simply the indifferent arithmetic of preservation. Stone on high ground endures. Reed and timber on a flooded plain disappears within a generation. The civilizations that survived to be excavated are not necessarily the first civilizations. They are the ones that happen to build in the right materials, on the right terrain, above the waterline, that history drew when the ice finally stopped melting. What the Indus Valley gives us is not an answer. It is a calibration, a demonstration of exactly what human beings were capable of at the earliest edge of the record we can read. Measure from there backward through the submerged millennia, and the question of what is missing becomes less abstract and more specific. Not a lost empire, not a vanished super-civilization. Perhaps just a dozen Mohenjo-daros, smaller, older, built on coastlines the sea has since taken, and with them, the earliest chapters of a story we have only been reading from the middle. In 2018, two scientists published a paper that asked a deceptively simple question. Adam Frank, an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester, and Gavin Schmidt, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, posed it this way. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth many millions of years before our own, what traces would it have left behind, and would those traces be detectable today? They called the inquiry the Silurian hypothesis. The name was borrowed from a fictional species of intelligent reptiles in a British television program, which they acknowledged immediately was a poor choice. It invites ridicule before the science can be heard. The science deserves to be heard. Frank and Schmidt were not claiming any such civilization existed. They stated clearly that they personally doubted it. What they were doing was building the forensic toolkit, asking what the geological record would show if it had existed, so that the absence or presence of those signals could be evaluated honestly rather than assumed. Their paper was published in the International Journal of Astrobiology and has been cited in mainstream scientific discussion since. It is not fringe work. It is a careful thought experiment by two credentialed scientists at major research institutions. The toolkit begins with carbon. When we burn fossil fuels, we alter the ratio of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere in a specific and measurable way. Carbon comes in three forms: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Plants preferentially absorb carbon-12 during photosynthesis. Over millions of years of burial and compression, ancient plant matter becomes coal, oil, and natural gas, all of them depleted in carbon-13 and entirely devoid of carbon-14, which decays away over tens of thousands of years. When those fuels are burned, they flood the atmosphere with carbon-12, driving down the ratios of carbon-13 and carbon-14 relative to carbon-12. This shift is measurable in ice cores, ocean sediments, and tree rings, and it is called the Suez effect. The Suez effect is the carbon isotope fingerprint of industrialization. It is not subtle. Before the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric carbon-13 sat at roughly -6.5 parts per thousand. Today, it has fallen to around -8. That shift, produced in roughly 150 years of industrial activity, is already embedded in the geological record and will remain detectable in sediment layers for millions of years. Any future geologist drilling through our era will see it clearly. The logic runs in both directions. If we would leave such a signal, then a prior industrial civilization would also have left one. Not in buildings, not in roads, not in any physical structure that erosion and plate tectonics would have consumed, but in the chemistry of the sediment layers corresponding to its era. Frank and Schmidt showed that such a signal would persist for millions of years, compressed into a thin band of rock, but chemically identifiable. They then asked whether any such signals appear in the geological record before human industrialization. The honest answer is, not obviously, at the industrial scale we would expect to see. The Anthropocene layer in the sediment record is characterized by multiple simultaneous signals: carbon isotope shifts, nitrogen spikes from agricultural fertilizers, heavy metal elevations, artificial radionuclides from nuclear testing, microplastic traces, and the specific chemical signatures of industrial byproducts. No comparable multi-signal anomaly of clearly artificial origin has been identified in the pre-human geological record. That is a real and meaningful constraint on what could have existed, but constraints have limits. Schmidt and Frank pointed out that a civilization that existed for only a few 100,000 years comparable in duration to our own entire species' existence, might leave a signal narrow enough in the sediment record to be easily missed or mistaken for a natural event. A few centimeters of compressed rock, representing tens of thousands of years, is easy to overlook in a core sample. And critically, the absence of a multi-signal industrial fingerprint does not foreclose the existence of complex, organized, pre-agricultural coastal societies. Those societies would not have burned fossil fuels on an industrial scale. Their carbon signal would be indistinguishable from background noise. This brings us to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the PET-TEM, an event that occurred approximately 56 million years ago and has been the subject of intense scientific interest precisely because its cause has never been fully agreed upon. Over the course of roughly 10,000 to 20,000 years, the Earth's global average temperature rose between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius. More than 2,000 gigatons of isotopically light carbon were injected into the atmosphere and oceans. Deep-sea species went extinct. The event lasted approximately 200,000 years before temperatures returned to baseline. The most widely accepted explanation for the PET-TEM is massive volcanism. The eruption of the North Atlantic igneous province, which produced enormous quantities of basalt across Iceland, Greenland, and the British Isles, releasing carbon that had been stored in organic-rich sediments the lava intruded upon. This explanation fits most of the evidence reasonably well, but it does not fit all of it. The rate of carbon injection at the onset of the PET-TEM was, in some estimates, faster than large-scale volcanism alone can comfortably explain, and the isotopic signature of the carbon involved remains the subject of ongoing scientific debate. Frank and Schmidt included the PET-TEM in their analysis. They noted that its carbon and temperature signatures are not categorically different from what an industrial civilization would produce. The signals overlap. They were careful to say this does not mean the PET-TEM was caused by a civilization. They said it means the geological record, at this level of resolution, cannot definitively distinguish between certain natural events and a short-lived industrial pulse. That is a statement about the limits of detection, not a claim about what happened 56 million years ago. There have also been several smaller carbon excursion events in the geological record. The Eocene thermal maximum 2, the Eocene thermal maximum 3, and various other hyperthermal events in the early Cenozoic, each showing elevated temperatures and carbon anomalies of uncertain origin. Scientists have proposed volcanic, orbital, and methane clathrate explanations for each. None has been definitively resolved. Frank and Schmidt's point is not that these events were caused by civilizations, but that the tools we would use to detect such events are the same tools we use to study these unexplained anomalies, and those tools have real resolution limits. What the Silurian hypothesis ultimately contributes to this story is not evidence for a lost civilization. It is a calibration of what we could and could not detect. A deep-time industrial civilization that lasted a few 100,000 years and then disappeared would leave a carbon signal that might be just barely distinguishable from natural events, or might not be distinguishable at all, depending on the rate and duration of its industrial activity. A pre-agricultural coastal civilization that never industrialized at scale would leave essentially no geochemical signal in the sediment record whatsoever. That second category is the relevant one for the questions this inquiry is actually asking. The civilizations we are considering, organized, complex, coastal, pre-agricultural, or early agricultural societies building in organic materials on lowland shelves that are now underwater, would not have triggered a Suez effect. They would not have left a nitrogen spike. They would not appear in the carbon record at all. Their absence from the geochemical record tells us nothing about whether they existed, because they would be invisible to that record by definition. The carbon signal is a powerful tool, and its absence is meaningful at the industrial scale. Below that threshold, it is silent. And the most interesting question in the archaeology of the deep past lives entirely below that threshold, in the layer of human complexity that predates industry by at least 10,000 years, and for which the only remaining evidence, if any survives at all, is lying on the floors of the world's continental shelves under tens of meters of cold water. Off the southern coast of the Peloponnese Peninsula in Greece, in a shallow bay called Vatika, the ruins of a complete Bronze Age town sit on the seabed in 1 to 4 meters of water. Its streets are still laid out. Its building foundations are intact. Its courtyards, chamber tombs, and cist graves are where the people who built them left them, preserved by the silt and salt water that swallowed the town gradually over centuries. The site is called Pavlopetri. Archaeologists first mapped it in 1968. It dates to between 2800 and 1200 BC, and it is the oldest known planned underwater town in the world. Pavlopetri tells us two things simultaneously. First is that entire towns do survive underwater under the right conditions: shallow, calm water, sandy sediment, relatively stable geology. The second is that this one was not found until 1968, despite being in one of the most archaeologically studied seas on Earth, within 4 meters of the surface, a short distance from an inhabited coastline. A complete Bronze Age town, sitting in plain sight, missed for 3,000 years. If that is what awaits discovery in 4 meters of Mediterranean water, the question of what might survive on the continental shelves at 40, 60, or 80 meters depth, in waters that have never been systematically surveyed, becomes considerably less abstract. Less than 1% of the ocean floor has been surveyed to any meaningful archaeological standard. The figure for the world's shallow continental shelves, the relevant zone for human prehistory, the area between the modern coastline and the 120-meter depth contour, is not significantly better. What has been found, however, suggests strongly that the preservation conditions on submerged continental shelves are not as hostile as absence of search effort might imply. Off the coast of Israel, near the town of Atlit, a submerged Neolithic village called Atlit Yam has been excavated in water 8 to 12 meters deep. The site dates to between 6900 and 6300 BC. It covers 40,000 square meters. Underwater archaeologists have recovered rectangular house foundations, stone-built water wells, a megalithic stone semicircle whose 7 massive stones once surrounded a freshwater spring, ritual installations, paved areas, botanical remains, animal bones, thousands of flint and stone tools, and 65 human skeletons lying undisturbed in their graves, exactly as they were placed 9,000 years ago. The skeletons at Atlit Yam are not an abstraction. They are people with names lost but lives recoverable, their diet reconstructed from isotope analysis, their health documented from their bones, their average lifespan established at an unusual 50 years for the period. They grew wheat, barley, and lentils. They fished. They kept cattle and pigs. They built permanent wells and arranged enormous stones around a spring in a pattern that almost certainly carried ritual meaning. They lived a settled, organized, productive life on a coast that the sea eventually swallowed, and they have been lying 9 meters underwater, perfectly preserved, since the town was abandoned as the water rose. Atlit Yam is not exceptional in its preservation. It is exceptional in having been found and excavated. Along the Israeli coast alone, archaeologists have identified dozens of submerged sites ranging from a Kebara occupation 22,000 years ago through Natufian and Neolithic periods to early Chalcolithic settlements. Each successive layer was built slightly higher on the coast, retreating upslope as the sea rose, and each earlier layer is now submerged progressively deeper. The Israeli coast has been searched. The coasts of Indonesia, China, India, and most of the tropical and subtropical world have barely been touched. Off the northwestern coast of Australia, in 2020, researchers from Flinders University completed the first systematic archaeological survey of Australia's submerged continental shelf. They found a 7,000-year-old site with stone artifacts preserved on the seabed. the first confirmed submerged prehistoric site in Australian waters. The significance was not merely the age. It was the proof of concept. Stone tools survive on tropical seafloors. They had expected to find nothing. They found intact evidence of human occupation, preserved in the sediment of a shelf that had been dry land until the seas rose at the end of the last ice age. One survey team, one targeted survey, in one corner of a vast unexplored shelf, and a site appeared. The Sunda Shelf alone, the submerged floor of what was once Sundaland, now the South China Sea and surrounding waters, covers approximately 1.8 million square kilometers. It was the most densely populated region of the Ice Age world for tens of thousands of years, home to the ancestral populations of billions of people alive today. It is also, archaeologically, almost completely unknown. The tropical waters, the depth, the distance from major research institutions, and the sheer scale of the survey task have combined to produce a near-total absence of investigation. A handful of surveys have been conducted. A handful of artifacts have been dredged up by fishing nets. The interior of that shelf has never been systematically examined. In the North Sea, the situation is different only because the oil and gas industry has inadvertently funded the work. Seismic surveys conducted for offshore energy exploration generated detailed maps of the Doggerland seabed, revealing an entire landscape of ancient river channels, lake basins, and elevated plains, a prehistoric geography reconstructed from sound waves. University of Bradford researchers have spent years using that data to reconstruct what Doggerland looked like at different moments in its disappearance. Trawler nets have pulled up Mesolithic artifacts for over a century. A barbed antler harpoon in 1931, hand axes recovered from the seabed near the English coast, worked flint and bone fragments from the harbor sediments of Rotterdam. The evidence is there. It surfaces accidentally when a net or a dredge or an industrial drill happens to pass through the right patch of seabed. Deliberate, systematic archaeological survey of those same deposits has been limited by funding, logistics, and the historical prioritization of land-based archaeology over marine. The Splash Coast Network, Submerged Prehistoric Archaeology and Landscapes of the Continental Shelf, was established in Europe in 2009 to coordinate research across 20 countries and all major European marine basins. Their 2020 publication cataloged over 2,500 find spots from the European shelf alone, ranging from individual stone tools to underwater villages. The Sunda Shelf, the Indian Ocean shelves, the shelves of West Africa and the Americas, these have no equivalent program. The reason the drowned world is largely unknown is not that nothing survives there. It is that finding what survives requires technologies, multi-beam sonar, sub-bottom profilers, remotely operated vehicles, sediment coring, that are expensive, slow, and have historically been deployed for industrial rather than archaeological purposes. The oil and gas sector has mapped more of the world's continental shelves than archaeology has, using exactly the techniques that would locate submerged prehistoric sites. That data exists. Much of it sits in corporate archives, commercially sensitive, largely inaccessible to researchers asking archaeological questions. What has been found on the world's submerged shelves in the limited searching that has occurred includes a 9,000-year-old village with megalithic monuments, wells, and burials off Israel, a 7,000-year-old site with preserved stone tools off Australia, a complete Bronze Age town off Greece, more than 2,500 find spots across the European shelf alone, Mesolithic artifacts pulled from the North Sea by fishing nets, submerged river channels, lake basins, and paleo shorelines across every continental margin that has been looked at seriously. Every time someone has looked with appropriate technology, something has been there. The question is not whether the drowned world contains evidence of past human life. It demonstrably does. The question is what systematic, well-resourced, globally distributed underwater archaeology would find if it were directed at the shelves where the majority of humanity lived for the majority of our species' existence. The answer to that question is not yet known, because the question has not yet been seriously asked. The ocean is the largest museum on Earth. It is also the least visited, and its oldest exhibits, the ones from before the flood, from the tens of thousands of years when the coastlines were hundreds of kilometers further out than they are today, have never been catalogued, curated, or in most cases, even located. They are there. We know they are there. We have not gone to look. What we are waiting for is the combination of will, funding, and technology that would make that search possible at scale. All three exist in some form: the sonar systems, the remotely operated vehicles, the sediment coring equipment, the institutional knowledge of what to look for and where. What has not existed is a coordinated, sufficiently funded, globally distributed program that treats the submerged continental shelves as the primary archaeological priority they arguably are, rather than a peripheral curiosity to be pursued when land-based budgets allow. The history of science is full of questions that waited decades or centuries for someone to decide they mattered enough to fund properly. This is one of them. The drowned world is not a metaphor. It is a geography, specific, measurable, bounded, and lying at depths that modern technology can reach. The oldest chapters of the human story may not be lost. They may simply be wet. In the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, pressed into clay in cuneiform script at Nineveh, and sitting today in the British Museum in London, a man named Utnapishtim the hero Gilgamesh about a flood. The gods, he says, decided to destroy humanity. One god warned him in a dream. He built a great vessel, loaded it with his family and all living creatures, and survived the waters that swallowed the world. When the floods receded, the vessel settled on a mountain. He sent out a dove, which returned. He sent a swallow, which returned. He sent a raven, which did not return and knew the land was dry. He descended the mountain and repopulated the earth. The Epic of Gilgamesh predates the Hebrew Bible's account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. Sumerian versions of the flood hero, called Ziusudra, appear on tablets dating to around 2100 BC. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic preserves a slightly different version. All three Mesopotamian traditions tell substantially the same story: a flood of divine origin, a survivor forewarned, a vessel, a mountain, birds sent to find dry land, and a world remade from the remnant. The structure is so consistent across versions that most scholars agree these accounts ultimately draw on a shared oral tradition considerably older than any of the tablets that recorded it. In the Satapatha Brahmana of ancient India, the first man Manu is approached by a small fish that warns him of an imminent catastrophe. The fish tells him to build a boat. When the waters rise, the fish, revealed as the god Vishnu, tows the boat to safety on a northern mountain. Manu alone survives and becomes the ancestor of all subsequent humanity. The Hindu flood tradition is among the oldest documented in the world and appears to predate significant contact with the Mesopotamian versions. Two separate civilizations on opposite ends of the ancient world, encoding the same essential memory. In ancient Greece, Deucalion receives warning from his father Prometheus that Zeus intends to flood the earth. He builds a chest and survives 9 days and nights of deluge before grounding on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. In the Norse tradition, the primordial giant Ymir is slain, and his blood floods the world. In the Irish mythological cycle, a woman named Cessair arrives in Ireland before the biblical flood and perishes in it. In the Chinese classic Hiking, the family of Fuhi survives a great flood that covers the mountains, emerging to repopulate the earth. In Mesoamerica, the Maya Popol Vuh describes a flood sent to destroy an earlier failed creation of humanity. The Aztec tradition preserves a man named Tata and his wife Nena, warned by the god Tezcatlipoca to hollow out a tree and float to safety. Scholars who have cataloged flood narratives across human cultures have arrived at numbers ranging from 200 to over 500 distinct traditions, depending on how broadly the category is defined. What is significant is not the number, but the distribution. These stories come from every inhabited continent, from cultures that had no documented contact with one another at the time the traditions formed, and from oral traditions in some cases demonstrably older than any writing system in existence. The most remarkable evidence for the antiquity of these traditions comes from Australia. Researchers Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, publishing in the journal Australian Geographer, analyzed 21 stories from Aboriginal Australian communities around the country's entire coastline. Every story described coastal flooding, land swallowed by the sea, islands that had once been connected to the mainland, bays and harbors that had once been dry valleys. Each story was geographically specific, describing local landmarks that now sit underwater. When the researchers compared the details of each story to the post-glacial sea level record for Australia, the stories mapped precisely onto events that occurred between 7,250 and 13,070 years ago. The oral traditions had preserved accurate geographical memory of specific coastal flooding events for up to 13,000 years. Across hundreds of generations, without writing, without institutions, without anything but the discipline of careful oral transmission. This finding has profound implications that reach well beyond Australia. If Aboriginal Australian oral traditions can accurately encode specific geographically verifiable memories of sea level rise for 13,000 years, then the flood traditions of Mesopotamia, India, Greece, China, and the Americas may not be metaphor or invention. They may be memory, generatedly across epochs of retelling, transformed by the symbolic frameworks of each culture, but ultimately rooted in something that was witnessed. The post-glacial sea level rise was a real event, global in extent, experienced by the coastal populations of the entire world. The traditions that describe it, in their wildly different cultural dress, may all be pointing toward the same set of events. This does not make the flood traditions historically reliable in their details. The boat, the ark, the warning deity, the mountain refuge, these are narrative frameworks that each culture imposed on the raw memory of rising water. What the traditions actually encode at their core may be nothing more complicated than this. The sea came and took the land, and the people moved to higher ground, and they never forgot it. That memory, compressed into story and passed down for 10,000 years, eventually became Utnapishtim, became Noah, became Manu, became the forgotten man in the hollow tree. The traditions also share, with unusual consistency, the figure of a survivor who carries knowledge forward. Not merely a survivor in the physical sense, someone who escaped the water, but a keeper of wisdom, a transmitter of skills, a figure who arrives among people and teaches them things they did not previously know. Utnapishtim is granted immortality and placed at the mouth of the rivers. Manu establishes the laws by which subsequent humanity lives. Q, in the Aztec tradition, is described as a feathered serpent who arrives from the sea and bestows on the people the foundations of agriculture, astronomy, and civilization. In the traditions of the Tano people of the Amazon, supernatural beings transported the ancestors to a new land and taught them how to survive. These figures have been interpreted by fringe theorists as evidence of an advanced civilization whose survivors seeded the earliest known cultures. That interpretation goes far beyond what the traditions actually say and far beyond what the evidence supports. But the traditions do carry a consistent pattern that is worth holding in mind as a question rather than discarding as conspiracy. Across many of the world's oldest flood traditions, the memory of losing a world to the water is paired with the memory of someone who knew things. Not gods in the supernatural sense necessarily, but people who arrived with knowledge that the receiving community did not have, and who were remembered across generations and across oceans as extraordinary. Whether that pairing reflects historical reality, displaced coastal peoples carrying accumulated knowledge into the inland populations that survived the floods, or whether it reflects a universal human tendency to frame catastrophe as followed by wisdom, cannot be determined from the myths alone. What the myths can tell us is that the people who made them remembered the water. They remembered losing something to it. And they remembered, or believed they remembered, that someone came after the water and taught them how to begin again. The most parsimonious explanation for the global distribution of flood traditions is the simplest one, that the post-glacial sea level rise, which flooded the coastlines of the entire world between approximately 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, was experienced by the ancestors of virtually every living human culture, and that the memory of that experience survived in story form because it was the most significant thing that happened to the people who witnessed it. The sea took everything they knew. Of course, they remembered. What those traditions cannot tell us is what was on the land that the sea took. They can tell us the land existed. They can tell us it was lost. The question of what was built on it, if anything beyond the ordinary settlements of ordinary coastal people, is a question that the traditions cannot answer. Only the seafloor can answer it. And the seafloor has not yet been asked. What the myths remember at their irreducible core is the flood. Whether the flood took anything extraordinary with it is the question that archaeology alone can resolve, and that archaeology, as yet, has barely begun to ask. After everything presented here, the honest answer to the question that opened this inquiry deserves to be stated plainly. Not sensationally, not dismissively, but with the precision the evidence actually supports. What do we know? What don't we know? And what would it take to find out? We know that modern human beings with full cognitive capacity, brains identical to ours, capable of everything ours are capable of, have existed for approximately 300,000 years. We know that complex, organized urban civilization appears in the record only in the last 5,000 to 6,000 of those years. We do not have a satisfying explanation, grounded in the evidence, for why 295,000 years passed in apparent silence before the cities appeared. The standard explanation, that agriculture had to precede urbanization, and agriculture required the post-glacial climate, is probably part of the answer. Whether it is the whole answer is genuinely unknown. We know that the sea level rose by approximately 120 meters between 20,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago, submerging roughly 27 million square kilometers of the world's most habitable coastal land. We know that the people who lived on that land were fully modern humans, living in the same way that humans have always lived on productive coastlines. Fishing, foraging, probably farming in some locations as the technology developed. We know that whatever they built on those coasts is now underwater. We know that almost none of it has been searched. We know that the oldest confirmed monumental architecture, Göbekli Tepe, predates the conventional beginning of civilization by more than 5,000 years, was built by people with no agriculture and no writing, required a level of social organization and coordinated labor that no previous model of prehistoric society could explain, and was then deliberately buried by the people who built it. We know that the world's oldest confirmed submerged settlement, Atlit Yam, contains permanent houses, stone wells, megalithic monuments, and human burials 9 meters underwater off the coast of Israel, preserved in remarkable condition. We know that every systematic survey of submerged continental shelf sediments that has been conducted has found evidence of prehistoric human occupation. We know that less than 1% of the ocean floor has been surveyed to any meaningful archaeological standard. We know that flood traditions exist in over 200 distinct cultures across every inhabited continent, many with no documented contact with each other, describing in consistent structural terms the loss of coastal land to rising water. We know that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been independently verified against the post-glacial sea level record and shown to preserve accurate geographical memory of specific coastal flooding events that occurred up to 13,000 years ago. We know that the oldest written story in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a story about a flood. These are things we know. They are not fringe claims, conspiracy theories or interpretations that depend on cherry-picked evidence. They are findings from peer-reviewed geology, archaeology, marine science, linguistics, and genetics published in mainstream journals and cited by mainstream researchers. Taken together, they establish the factual basis for a straightforward proposition. Our picture of when and where human civilization began is almost certainly incomplete, and the most likely location of the missing evidence is underwater. What we do not know is considerably larger. We do not know whether any of the submerged coastal settlements of the Ice Age and early post-glacial period constituted what would meaningfully be called a civilization. That is, a complex, organized, urban society with division of labor, governance, and shared symbolic systems operating at scale. We do not know because we have not looked. The absence of evidence here is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of the absence of the search. What the evidence does not support is equally important to state clearly. It does not support the existence of a technologically advanced pre-industrial civilization, a society that built in stone at monumental scale, maintained intercontinental trade networks, or achieved anything approaching the sophistication of the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia, but has left no trace whatsoever in the sediment record, no anomalous carbon or nitrogen signal, no persistent geochemical fingerprint of the kind that even modest industrialization would produce. Such a civilization at that scale would almost certainly have left detectable traces. None have been found. What the evidence is fully consistent with is something considerably more modest and considerably more interesting, that the settled, organized, complex societies that we call the first civilizations did not emerge from nothing in 3500 BC, that their antecedents, the communities that developed the social organization, the agricultural knowledge, the symbolic systems, and perhaps the early urban forms that later flowered into the Indus Valley, existed on the coastlines that are now submerged during the millennia between the Ice Age maximum and the stabilization of the sea level around 7,000 years ago. That the conventional start date of civilization is not when complexity began. It is when complexity left evidence that survived. The word civilization comes from the Latin civis, citizen, one who belongs to a city. The question is not whether the people of the submerged coasts were as intelligent, as organized, or as culturally sophisticated as the people of Sumer. Almost certainly they were. The question is whether, in the 10,000 years before Sumer, on the fertile coastal lowlands that the sea consumed, any of them built something that deserves the name. The question is open. The answer is on the seafloor. Consider what the last 100 years of archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated. Troy was a myth until Schliemann dug. The Indus Valley civilization was unknown until 1924. The Minoans were a footnote until Evans excavated at Knossos. Göbekli Tepe was a medieval cemetery until 1994. Every generation has discovered that the human past is older, more complex, and more surprising than the generation before it believed. There is no reason to think this generation has reached the limit of those discoveries. The limit, this time, is a technical one, not the limits of human digging, but the limits of human diving. There are people alive today whose lifetimes will encompass the development and deployment of the underwater survey technologies that could begin to answer this question systematically. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AI-assisted sonar analysis, sub-bottom profilers capable of detecting buried anthropogenic layers at shelf depths. All of these technologies exist in early or developed form. What does not yet exist is the coordinated, adequately funded, globally distributed research program that would direct them at the question with the seriousness it deserves. The oldest civilization in the world may be Sumer. It may be the Indus Valley. It may be something we found yesterday and have not yet finished excavating. Or it may be something that has been sitting on a continental shelf for 10,000 years, waiting for someone to go and look. We do not know which of these is true. We are capable of finding out. The decision to do so or not to do so is entirely a matter of human choice. The sea has had these coasts for 7,000 years. It has not destroyed them. Sediment cores drilled from submerged European shelves have returned fine-grained paleo-environmental data, ancient DNA, and intact organic layers from Mesolithic landscapes. The preservation conditions, where they exist, are in many ways better than on land, protected from the erosion and agricultural disruption that has damaged so many terrestrial sites. The material is there, the question is there, the tools exist. What has not yet existed at the scale this question demands is the decision to treat the submerged prehistoric world as the primary unresolved problem in human history, which is what it almost certainly is. The history we tell ourselves about where we came from, how long it took us to organize into complex societies, and what the earliest human civilizations actually looked like is built on a record that covers, at most, the exposed fraction of the inhabited world. The rest is underwater, and the rest is waiting.